Shopify's point-of-sale system helps you sell at every stage of your business. Need a fast and secure way to take payments in person? We've got you covered. How about card readers you can rely on anywhere you sell?
Thanks. Have a good one.
Yep, that too. Want one place to manage all your online and in-person sales? That's kind of our thing. Wherever you sell, businesses that grow with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 a month trial at shopify.com/listen. Shopify.com/listen.
Are you familiar with the story of Medea? She's a character from the world of ancient Greek mythology who's most closely associated with the tale of Jason and the Argonauts. Medea was a woman with a knowledge of magic from the Black Sea region of Colchis. She was instrumental in helping Jason secure the long sought-after golden fleece. However, Medea's story ends in tragedy. After falling in love with Jason, she bore him 2 children and returned with him to the city of Corinth. But soon, the former Argonaut decided that the foreign-born mother of his children was not the most politically advantageous partner. If he was to marry the comely daughter of the local king Creon, that would be the making of a mighty dynasty. So he made the fateful decision to set aside Medea and marry a princess. This was a huge mistake. In her grief and rage, Medea killed both of her children to punish Jason for his fickle ways. Then, in some versions of the story, Medea makes her escape from Corinth in a flying chariot pulled by dragons. And this, my friends, is why I love Greek mythology. The Medea story truly contains multitudes. It's a rumination on gender dynamics, murderous rage, and feminine power, while also being a wild-ass tale where a previously unintroduced dragon chariot can just appear. But even that very brief summary of Medea that I just laid out for you is an amalgamation of a number of different traditions. The earliest version of Medea's story is preserved in the work of the archaic Greek poet Hesiod. But many of the best-known details about her myth have come down to us from the play Medea by the beloved Athenian playwright Euripides. Her story was then fleshed out much later by the Roman poet Ovid. There are many centuries that separate Hesiod, Euripides, and Ovid. And as a result, each artist has his own twist on the character of Medea, informed by the intervening years of oral storytelling and artistic production. Which version of the Medea story should we accept as the definitive telling? Well, as my guest today has reminded me, that question deeply misunderstands the nature of myth. There is no definitive version of a myth, because myth is a living tradition. Myths are forever evolving, both informing and responding to culture. This is why myths can be contradictory and often refuse to play by the rules of logic or chronology. Mythological features can be malleable. Their characteristics can change depending on who is telling the story and in what context. Every version of a myth is part of the mythological whole. And this might be why myths continue to break my brain. This insight into the nature of mythology came from the podcaster Liv Albert, host of the long-running classical mythology podcast, Let's Talk About Myths, Baby. And yes, you do need to sing it like the Salt and Pepper song. Liv has spent the last 8 years diving deep into the world of Greek and Roman mythology, on a quest to celebrate what is wonderful about those tales while also being critical of how this mythological tradition has been used and abused. What other deep insights into the nature of myth can we squeeze out of Liv Albert? Let's find out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 228. You talking about myths, baby? Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to let everyone listening know that you can hear this podcast ad-free if you become a patron. Go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and start supporting at $5 or more every month to get access to an ad-free feed and a library's worth of patrons-only Our Fake History extra episodes, including shows on El Dorado, Merlin, Nikola Tesla, and finally the episode on the Bronze Age collapse. Yes, friends, the long-promised extra episode is just about done. I will be releasing that to the patrons within the next week or two. I promise. That show will be available to patrons supporting at all levels, even the $1 folks. So it's never been a better time to sign up for Patreon. This week, we have one of my occasional interview episodes. My guest today is Liv Albert. Liv is the host, creator, writer, editor, and producer of Let's Talk About Myths, baby. The podcast looks at the vast canon of Greek and Roman mythology and presents the story in a way that is deeply researched and thoroughly told. Liv also does not hold back on the details of the stories that have been sugar-coated and treated with kid gloves over the millennia. She also brings a fresh, modern analysis to many of these tales. Liv has a degree in English literature and classics from Concordia University in Montreal. In her time hosting Let's Talk About Myths, Liv has interviewed many of the world's leading mythology experts and classicists. She is also the author of 2 books on Greek mythology: Greek Mythology, The Gods, Goddesses, and Heroes Handbook, and Nectar of the Gods, a book of mythologically inspired cocktail recipes. She also just started work on a new adaptation of the Odyssey for young readers. Liv was gracious enough to join me for a chat over Zoom from her home in Toronto, my old stomping grounds. Now, as you will hear, we really ended up getting deep in this chat. This is one that I think will be of particular interest to those of you who really know your Greek mythology and have a good understanding of ancient history already. Because we're both nerds for this stuff, we kind of hit the ground running here and go really deep into the nuances of these stories. We also end up jumping right into the world of Athenian drama and Roman poetry. So, in case you get lost, you should know that Euripides, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes were all Athenian dramatists who wrote many of the plays that have survived from classical Athens. We also get talking about the myths of Oedipus, Helen of Troy, Medea, and Medusa. And to be honest, the way the conversation evolved, we didn't really stop to give those stories their full context. So if you're not sure what we are talking about, you may need to stop and look some of those up. But I know that most of you listening are real heads for this stuff, so I trust that you'll be able to follow along. In the end, this was a really fun conversation. I love getting into the weeds on all of this stuff, and Liv is clearly the same kind of person. So I really hope you enjoy this chat. Without any further ado, here is my conversation with Liv Albert from Let's Talk About Myths, baby. Okay, Liv, thank you so much for being a guest on Our Fake History. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I am very excited to speak history, but also to a fellow Canadian podcaster.
Yes. Yeah. No, obviously, before we started recording here, we were talking about how the Canadian podcasters in this world need to stick together. Okay, Let's Talk About Myths, baby, is now well over 600 episodes deep. Congratulations on that.
700 today. Thank you.
700?
I didn't even notice. I know I punched it in when I hit schedule yesterday and thought, oh, I've really done a lot of episodes.
Well done. That is like incredibly impressive. So you're now 700 episodes deep. What keeps you excited about classical mythology? And what keeps you coming back to those stories?
I mean, I think that they are absolutely endless. And in all honesty, the 700 is also that over the past years, I've started having conversations with scholars, experts, novelists in the field. And so we've gone pretty far beyond mythology at this point. The episode I released today was about Rome's colonization of North Africa and then France's later colonization of North Africa. So, we really expand at this point well beyond myth. But personally, I think myth is one of these things where as soon as you get deep enough into the context around it, the understanding of it, you realize that you can study it forever and still come up with new ideas, new conclusions. Like it's really because of sort of how these stories were developed, they are absolutely timeless, but in a way where apparently you can also just create thousands and thousands of hours of content and still never run out.
Yeah, well, and it doesn't hurt that the stories have been iterated on so many times, right? Like even within the kind of classic mythological canon, there's all sorts of little sort of tweaks on the tales. And I found in my own journey through this stuff that often stories that I thought I knew are deeply strange and quite different when you go to like the earliest versions of them.
Yeah, the actual sources themselves. Yeah, well, people love to forget because, not even love to forget. It's more just the way that we are kind of taught to understand myth, unless you are in as deep as I now am. We're taught to understand myth as sort of like a typical story, beginning, middle, end, and that these are sort of the set ones with these set details. But once you do some digging, you realize, oh, well, for the Greek myths alone, we're talking 800 years of culture developing in that time. So nothing's going to stay the same. I use this comparison with my listeners all the time. Like, the difference between Shakespeare and now, like that is a shorter amount of time than from Homer just to like the playwrights, and so obviously things are going to change. These details are going to change, the understanding. And so, yeah, it's really never ending in terms of like understanding it.
It's interesting when you're reading ancient sources who are discussing the myths, because some of them seem to have a true religious devotion to the tales, while others are very flippant about them. They joke on them. They seem like they don't take them particularly seriously. In your experience researching this stuff, how seriously or literally did the Greeks and the Romans take their mythology?
Great question. I can't speak to Rome quite as much because I just am not as familiar. But I will say that there's this ongoing idea that like the Romans like quote unquote stole their stories from the Greeks, and like
Sure.
that is definitely not it. There's a lot to say about that, which I mean we could get into if you wanted, but mostly I'm just going to say I will primarily talk about the Greeks, not least because Rome then was like also quite late, a bit later, and so they were doing really different things with their religion. But in terms of the Greeks, it's like 50-50. But I also think the biggest thing to keep in mind and why these things can sound really confusing to us now is just that all like so much of how we take all of this stuff in is from this like Judeo-Christian lens that the West has become. And it just in the way that it makes it hard for us to conceptualize how the people before, would have understood their deities because
Right.
and I mean, and the biggest thing to keep in mind with this question in general is how many centuries we're talking about when it comes to Greek myth. Like, it's really easy to think of it as just this like one little time period where like Greek myth was a thing. But, if we are talking about like this question is answerable in so many different ways because like, well, what time period, right?
Right, of course.
The earliest stories that we have are Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and then of course what those are, like you kind of mentioned earlier, like is this oral tradition eventually getting written down? We kind of understand that the stories we attribute to Homer, who probably wasn't one guy, but who
Sure, of course.
attribute to Homer, were being developed over like 300 years of these stories being developed before they were ever written down, if not longer, right? They were being told and workshopped and, sung over and over and over again. And then eventually in what I've heard from certain experts in this is, maybe around the Archaic period. So we're talking 6th century in Athens is when anyone ever bothered to write it down in a way that then ended up getting preserved for us today. But also it's, important to remember that like even the oldest actual physical version that we have is only like a few hundred years old, maybe long. I mean, that's probably it's probably more like 5 or 6, maybe even 1,000, but it is nowhere near from actual ancient Greece, right? Because that's just not how these things happen.
Sure.
And so, it's like, okay, well, Homer is from this time period. Those stories are proposing to tell a story from a much earlier time period even. And so we have these gods and stuff involved. I mean, this is a really roundabout way of answering this question, but I will get there. And so, at that time and when these earlier other archaic myths are coming about, Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days are the best other example of this, or like the sort of second oldest. And these things are from a time period where I think that most of it was pretty believed generally, as a kind of literal belief structure, but that also revolved a lot around how the people were still figuring out the earth and science and the world around them and how they connected with it and how everything came about. And so the beliefs are coming from this really practical place, right? Like this really just sort of basic need to understand the world. Like, okay, the earth is where life comes from. Gaia creates the earth. Well, Gaia needed, a companion, so she made the sky, and then they start having children and things like that. And so it's really this really practical way of understanding this. There's a thunderstorm. Oh, Zeus must be angry, or he's trying to get our attention. There's an earthquake. Well, Poseidon, is shaking something in the sea. He hit his trident somewhere. There's a volcano. Well, that's from, this war we had with the giants, and they imprisoned the giants under mountains and thus volcanoes. And so it's just like this really practical way of understanding the world. Then you get a little later and, you get to things like the plays, the tragedies, which is where we get a lot of what we consider myths now. But even that betrays this lack of context, right? Because the plays, like say Oedipus, Tyrannos, Oedipus the king, one of the most famous Greek myths. It only survives in the form of a play. It only survives in this form by Sophocles. Otherwise, the earliest kind of mention that is mentioned in the Odyssey, but just as like this side note, like, okay, Oedipus and accidentally married his mother. There was a whole thing.
Yeah.
It's like one line. The mother has a different name in the Odyssey. It's Epicaste instead of Jocasta. And so, we know that it's an earlier story. We know that Sophocles was working off of a myth. We don't have it. All we have is Sophocles' play. And so people love to say like, oh, well, the myth of Oedipus goes like this. But that's kind of like saying that Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet is the true original Romeo and Juliet, or like that they're interchangeable, right? Which is like, that's crazy. Great adaptation, let's be honest, but like it is not the original Romeo and Juliet. Or like any kind of adaptation. It's the idea of saying that like Marvel's Thor is inherently the same as Norse mythology's Thor. Like that's more of a stretch. But still, it's like, well, this play was written for an audience. It was made to entertain. It had to keep people in their seats. It wanted to win an award. It had to fit in the stage structure. It had to, have a chorus that's going to tell this part of the story. Like all of these things are happening and being put into a piece of reception. It's like making a movie adaptation of history and suggesting that it's exact and unalterable. And so it's like way more interesting to think like, well, what the hell is the myth? We don't know. We probably will never know. That's cool.
But what you're saying, I've come to believe that actually that is just a more explicit example of what happens with all of human history. This is like where my own head has gone after years of doing my podcast, is that like anytime we sit down and decide we are going to tell a story, even a true story, we are creating artifice. And with a play, the artifice is really obvious, right? We are literally creating a piece of theater and we expect our audience to know some things already, right? And and Oedipus is a perfect example where like the playwright is going in being like, the audience knows something that the character does not know. And the dramatic tension rests in that. But already we have that artifice. And then just the more I've been studying, that spot where mythology and history collide, I've come to believe that that is the process of constructing our entire reality. I mean, not to get maybe too heady about it, but
yes.
because I think even the most objective or journalistic, scientific approach to history is still an act of writing, an act of creation, an act of literally editing the deluge of information that is perceiving reality.
Everything about history is subjective. Every single thing.
And I think all you can then hope for is like a variety of voices, a variety of perspectives, and that you can sort of draw from and be like, okay, well, if there's at least sort of some sort of shared a consensus on things, then that's where we can kind of grab onto something we can call truth. But I like the idea of that, like mythology just becoming a play is actually the miniature of that whole process. I just find that so fascinating. I love it.
Oedipus is my favorite example for that because it's one of these quite rare examples where we don't have any surviving myth from earlier, but we know really explicitly that it was a very well-known myth.
Yeah.
Like, because we also know that other playwrights also did plays about Oedipus. And that's where that's another thing that it's really interesting and frustrating, when we are kind of lacking in surviving plays. Like, I mean, the plays generally they keep me up at night because we only have surviving plays from 3 tragedians, but there were hundreds. We only have, in terms of Sophocles and Aeschylus, we only have like 6, I think, around then from each of them. But they were both writing and winning awards for decades.
Yeah.
With Euripides, we have lots more. And do you know the story of why we have more Euripides than anyone else?
I don't. I'd love to know.
Okay. Oh my God, I would love to tell you. So the plays are really interesting because, I mean, one, like I just explained with the Oedipus, like they give us this information that we otherwise would never know, both in terms of like a myth that might be lost or like an audience, what type of, story an audience would be taking in that we might not otherwise know. We get this idea of like an actual, like a movie version of something, right? In these plays. And so with Aeschylus and Sophocles, well, and Euripides at the beginning, these are the 3 that so many people had to decide were worth preserving. The reason we have those three primarily is because they were preserved for Byzantine school children.
Right.
They were the Shakespeares that we had to learn in school. You know, like in the Canadian school system, we have like a handful of Shakespeare. You read one every grade in high school, and like those are the ones you know, right?
Yeah.
That's what these were. That's what those were. They were the ones that were preserved for schools. So the Byzantines were copying them so that we physically have them today.
Right.
So they were the most popular. They were the ones that were meant to teach you something. They were the ones that they could use to teach various things, whether it's even just like reading and writing. Like they've served this really important purpose.
Yeah.
And that's true for what's true for Aeschylus and Sophocles, and like about that same number of Euripides.
Yeah.
But with Euripides, we also have like, I think it's like maybe 8 or so. I need to memorize these numbers, but we have like something like 19 Euripides plays, and a huge chunk of them, maybe more than half, are what we now call the alphabet plays. And those exist not because they were read in schools, not because they were considered the best or the ones to be taught. They survive because this one Byzantine collector had a collection, like a complete collection of Euripides that was separated off into like a handful of scrolls in alphabetical order. And one of those survived randomly. One of those was like just managed to be preserved. And so we have like 9 plays by Euripides that were preserved completely at random. And what that means is like not only that we just like have more stuff from the ancient world, and how cool is that, but also it means that we actually have an example of the rest of the plays.
Yeah.
The plays that weren't the blockbusters, right?
Sure.
And in those plays, we learn some of the weirdest, most interesting stuff. And also like an even better example of like what I was talking about with the Oedipus stuff, or like these, because you know, the changes that playwrights may or may not have made, usually we'll never know. There's a handful of examples, like Medea is not one of the alphabet plays. It was preserved intentionally, but Medea is so famous because she kills her children.
Of course.
But Euripides put that in, we think. There's no source before Euripides that has her kill her children.
Whoa, I didn't know that. That's huge.
Yeah, really huge. It's really
Blockbuster.
huge. So it's like, did he just make that a thing because he wanted to surprise the audience, or was that a thing beforehand? We don't know. But specifically with the alphabet plays, the best example for like what kind of impact they have by just surviving at random is in a play called The Helen. And so it's about Helen of Troy, Helen of Sparta, and it proposes, it's the best, it's the weirdest play. Also, Euripides wrote a lot of plays that were like 50-50 comedy tragedy that were just like these kind of like bawdy, weird escape stories. The Helen is one of them. And so it presents the idea that Helen was never taken to Troy, that instead she was like whisked away by, I believe it was a god who intervened and replaced the real Helen with an eidolon, which is essentially a ghost, and then sent the real Helen to Egypt. This play picks up at the end of the Trojan War. Helen has been staying in Egypt for these 10 years. She's been like imprisoned by this Egyptian king, and she has just been kind of trying to get home. She's vaguely heard that the Trojan War has been happening in her name. She knows there's like this fake version of her that's been there. And I'm forgetting like all of the beats, but essentially like it comes up that like Menelaus, while leaving the Trojan War, gets shipwrecked on the beaches nearby. He rolls up wearing a fishnet. We know that he was like literally like lost all his clothes in the shipwreck, and he just like put on a fishnet, and he like stumbles in, and he's this like bumbling fool. And Helen picks up all the pieces. Helen makes a plan of escape. Helen figures everything out, and then it's like, and then we get this like reveal that there was an idol on there, and like poof, it like disappears into a cloud. Like, it's the most bizarre story. And so, you know, imagine that survived, but the Iliad didn't, or
Right.
nothing else, right? And then we're like, oh wow, the story of the Trojan War is like that this woman was replaced by a ghost, and meanwhile she was in Egypt the whole time. Like we would have never
Right.
no idea because that's what it was. And it was not his most famous. It didn't win awards, but it was preserved at random, and because of that, we know it. And we also know that
Yeah.
he didn't invent that idea because there's this fragment that survives from elsewhere. It might have even been like Scolion, which is like marginalia notes on something like the Helen, um, where we know that there was I believe it's Stesichorus. There was an archaic poet. There's always two that I mix up, but it might have been Stesichorus. Anyway, that wrote a poem that also presents this idea that there was an eidolon version of Helen
Oh,
and that she
yeah.
was in Egypt. So we also know that Euripides didn't make it up. So was it like a wider story? Were people talking about that? Was it possible? And so it just, yeah, I don't even know where this question started, but thank
Oh
you for
no, I
indulging.
love it. I love it.
I,
Well, we actually started with like what it did were there or how seriously did the
oh,
Greeks
right.
take their but
Yeah.
no, this is
But like
perfect because
50-50, yeah.
no, but this is perfect because it's like, well, clearly Euripides felt like he could play with that tradition.
Yeah.
And clearly an audience of Athenians sat down and were like, oh, look what he's doing with this story.
Yeah.
In the same way that like, we might like take in like a multiversal Spider-Man story and be like,
Yeah.
oh, look, this time Spider-Man's Miles Morales. Interesting.
Yeah. You're like, oh, this is a weird version.
Yeah,
Cool.
this is a weird take on this. Oh, Helen
Yeah.
as a ghost. Cool. I
Yeah.
love that though. Man, that's the stuff that I live for. Live
Same, which is why I
like
can tell it like at any moment of it. And the number of times I've just randomly been like, "Can I tell you about Euripides' like alphabet plays?"
well, I see one of the questions I actually had for you was what is your favorite mythical deep cut? And
Oh God,
that's
that might be it.
definitely got to be one of them.
Yeah.
Do you while we're on the topic, do you have any more at your fingertips like a story that you think most even fans of this type of mythology might not know?
I mean, God, there are probably so many. I mean, yeah, that Helen one blows my mind. Um, One of the things, this is not necessarily like a story that people don't know, because of course that's like blanking for me right now. But I think a really interesting misconception, and maybe this was good for the first question too, but is so my absolute long time forever obsession is Medusa.
Mm,
And she's become that because of the way that both listeners have interacted with me about her, but also the more I learn about the way that her story has been like tweaked
mhm.
over time. So like we think of Medusa as this scary monster, snakes for hair, she had to be killed. I have had people, I've had tweets back in the day when Twitter was viable where, I'd tweet one thing about Medusa and I'd have all of these people like screaming this stuff at me, things like, oh, she had to be killed, she was terrorizing the land, things like that, this idea. And I understand where people are coming from because like there's all these, we have so many stories of like these monsters that were doing that, like, Heracles's kills and things like that. Medusa does not fit any of that, but we have this idea in our head that she does. But not
I
only,
just love the idea of the person out there that's like they had to get her and like still feeling very emotionally attached to like the evils of Medusa.
I had a comment yesterday. This thing never goes away. The way people react to her, it's super weird. And
Interesting. Really?
I've started developing some like pretty into like deep theories about her. Just, I mean, I wrote an introduction to a book about Medusa last year, and so
Mhm.
I did even deeper dives. But the thing that I find so interesting is in every version of her story that survives from before Ovid, who is Roman,
Yeah.
everything from before then, there is no record of her harming anyone. There's
Interesting.
no mention of statues, stone people around her. There is no mention of a single victim or a single justification for her death. The reason why Perseus goes to get her is simply, there's a lot to the story of Perseus that I won't fully recap, but the basics is there's this king on Seriphos, Polydectes, who wants Perseus dead because he wants to marry his mother. It's a whole thing, but he wants Perseus dead. And so he has a reason to ask Perseus to go get him something. And so he's like, well, I want you to go get me the head of a Gorgon. And, you know, depending on the sources where things come in, but essentially we know that the Gorgons are these three divine creatures. They are the children of gods. They're the children of sea gods. And they live on the furthest edges of the world. They live beyond ocean, which means you're like the edge of night is how it's called. So it's like where they thought that the sun was going down, like that's the edge of the world.
Cool way to say that too.
It really is the edge of night. It's the best.
Yeah.
And so that's where they lived. And so essentially Polydectes just says, Perseus, I need you to bring me the head of a Gorgon. And then we hear he has to go get Medusa's because she's the only one who's mortal. There's nothing about why he needs Medusa's head except that physically he can get it. The other ones he physically could not do. So it's like, okay, well, you got to go for Medusa. We never have an explanation of why she's the only mortal. Mm-hmm. It's just the way it is. He sneaks up on her while she is sleeping, cuts her head off. Her sisters are screaming after him, and he flies away. That's the whole of it. There is no detail on her being vicious. It's just that she's like quote unquote monstrous. And so all of these ideas have been developed about what that means, but so much of it ties to her being a woman who could defend herself against a man. Like that's essentially all there is.
Wow.
Is that she is a woman who could protect herself. Like she could turn people to stone. She was a threat only in the fact that she could defend herself.
And so in that early version, they do say that she has this like power to turn people to stone, but not that she's necessarily used it.
Not really. Well, yes and no.
Okay.
It comes up because once her head is off her body, she can turn things to stone.
Okay.
But there isn't like an explicit, like she can do this while she's alive. It's the assumption is there because the other thing about myths is that they weren't there to like answer all the questions we have. The way people come to me all the time, like, I want to know this, that, and the other thing. And I'm like, sorry to tell you that like they weren't concerned like we were with questions.
I love those little moments in myth as well. Like my favorite moment in the Theseus story is when he has the confrontation with Medea and then she flies away on a chariot pulled by dragons.
Oh yeah.
And it's just like out of nowhere, there's just like a dragon chariot.
Well, Medea has a lot of dragon chariots, but I will say to just be that ridiculous nerdy person, the only time she has one in outside of Euripides' play is in Ovid. So technically, and this I was going to get to with Medusa as well, technically not a myth.
Oh, there you go. So it's just, this is a Roman poet putting his twist.
Yeah.
Right.
Because also, well, and it gets Medusa is the other big change that Ovid does and it has like affected us forever. Yeah. Is that Ovid introduces all of these wild ideas that change her story fundamentally. Ovid tells us that she was once a beautiful mortal woman, that Poseidon assaulted her in Athena's temple, that because of that, Athena punished her by transforming her beautiful hair into snakes.
Sure.
So that creates this like completely alternate version, and people really have like held on to it because it presents some other ideas. I personally don't like it. I think it's much more interesting for her to have just been born like that. She's not a monster. That's what she looked like. You know, she's like any divine creature. She was born like that. She's the daughter of gods. That's it.
Sure.
And you know, there's so many layers to the Ovid thing.
I can see.
We didn't have talk forever, but
no, but I can see how people glommed onto that, right? Because it makes her a more fantastical creature, right?
Yeah.
It's the image of the snakes for hair. Like artists have just loved it ever since, and even now, you know, like artists love drawing the snake hair, and I even remember as a kid being fascinated by that image because it is so just fascinating. There's something about it, you know?
It is. Well, and that idea of her with like the human face and snakes for hair is like so, I mean, it is absolutely captivating. Agreed entirely. But it is also very not Greek. Like in most versions of her from Greek art, a Gorgon is like a very explicit type of creature. It's like there are snakes for hair, but that's not even the main point. Like they have tusks and fangs and sometimes wings and this like big gaping smile. Like they're distinctly inhuman.
Sure.
And so it's a really interesting thing to then have this like humanized form of her in Ovid. And he adds all these other layers and things, you know, but he's the one who's like, she's surrounded by statues of people.
Right.
But that doesn't exist before that. But the thing about Ovid,
That really makes her like a Batman villain, you know?
it does, exactly. It makes her like have a reason to be killed, which doesn't exist in the earlier sources, which is why it's so interesting. But especially like just a wrap up on Ovid, but also tie in this Medea aspect that you brought up, because I mean, a lot of Medea's story only survives in Ovid as well, which is interesting. Like, he has her flying around in that dragon chariot everywhere, which is my favorite. She's just popping off on that dragon
ripping
chariot
around. Yeah.
Oh, it's the best. But you know, the thing about Ovid, and Ovid writes these stories really, really beautifully, and so people want to tell them as if they are like the kind of core myth, and I understand that desire. They are stunning. I love Ovid. But Ovid is a Roman writing stories about Greek myths through the lens of Rome, and with the intention of eventually leading to the story of the founding of Rome.
Right.
You know, so there's so much going on. There's also like an enormous debate to be had about whether or not it was explicitly pro-Augustan propaganda or like under the surface, like anti-Augustan
I've heard
propaganda.
This. Yeah, because he and Augustus famously have a big falling out, right?
They do. It was after that, and this was coming around the similar time to the Aeneid, which is like really explicit Augustan propaganda. So you know, there's so much going on, but the core thing to keep in mind with Ovid as a source is that he wrote it, whereas myth is cultural storytelling, cultural memory that is eventually written down, but it is almost never like, I really don't think there, I mean, there's some outliers, but I think that generally when we're talking about myth, anytime it is written in that kind of explicit way, it's like reception of myth. It's his version, like the plays, right? It's the same as the plays in that way, because myth as a more, excuse me, myth as a concept is more about this like telling of a cultural story, more than it is about like authoring a work. You know, like the big difference is he sat down and he wrote it, and that's not true for like 90% of the other stories that we have, and that's interesting in itself. So I mean, Ovid does some great work with the dragon chariot, but like I said, Euripides introduces the dragon chariot in that at the very end of his play Medea with the dead children, who he also might have introduced, she flies off in a dragon chariot with her dead kids it with her. It's awesome. I mean, I know it's dark, but it's awesome.
Sure.
But the most exciting part of that is that the ancient Greek theater had, depending on the time period, but particularly when this was coming about, they had this, they had a crane that they used on the stage, and it's called the machina, the machine. The machina was used to bring gods over the stage for the audience. Primarily, it was like for the ending where the gods come in and they wrap things up in a nice little bow. It's where we get Deus Ex Machina, the god in the machine. It's that's Latin, and I always forget the Greek one. Something mechanos. And when it comes to Medea uses this crane to fly over the stage in like 2,500 years ago. She's flying over the stage in this dragon-drawn chariot with her dead children inside, and that's one of the only examples we have of the crane being used for not a god. And it is a woman who's just killed her children and flown off into the sunset. And I just think, like, I mean, Euripides is my favorite for like 10,000 reasons, but that is one of them, because like, how wild is that to be like, no, I'm just going to change this story. I'm going to change how we use the stage. I'm going to change the function of tragedy as an art form for this.
Yeah, no, I love that. And that must have blown people's minds.
Yes,
too.
imagine seeing that.
Right? You're like,
so
cool. He's using the mechanos for a woman who just killed their children.
Yeah. Like, this is a thing like, reserved for the gods.
Yeah, but I could also just see, like, because I'm with you, I really feel like the ancients were more like us than we sometimes like to think. And so I'm sure there was sort of like one theater goer who was like, this is sacrilege. Like, what am I watching? And then another more sophisticated viewer being like, oh, no, I see. Oh, what an inversion. No, this guy's actually a genius. And like, then afterwards, they're like at the symposium being like, I don't know if I get down with this Euripides play. It's like, no, man, he's just like way ahead of the curve here, you know?
I think about that all the time because I would have been those people. But like Euripides was really 50-50 in how he was received. He didn't win a lot. He was definitely not the most famous. People really, really were like thrown by him a lot. There's a lot of stories from the ancient world, particularly from Aristophanes, who's a contemporary comedy writer, and he loved to go on and write it into his plays about how Euripides was a misogynist and hated
Oh, yeah.
women.
Interesting.
It is because all of his examples, it's so funny to me because he wrote like women talking about this, but also like all women were played by men. So like there's layers
Oh
going
man,
on
there's
here.
a layer. Yeah.
Yeah, but all of the examples for why Euripides hated women are stories like his Medea or his Phaedra, his like there's just this long list of like him writing women who do bad things and
Yeah.
the Aristophanes saying that like that means he hates women.
Yeah.
And meanwhile it's like from a modern perspective, I look back and I'm like Euripides was the most feminist version of that we have of anybody back then.
Right.
Because he
Right.
wrote real women doing terrible things. He wrote equality. He wrote like, and people were so, because I mean, obviously I could talk forever about like the role of women and the
Sure.
subjugation of women, particularly in ancient Athens, because they were literally like the elite women were meant to be in the house all the time, not doing anything out ever.
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
they were possessions. And so, this idea that like they decided that he hated women because he wrote them like killing men is like, nah, you're afraid of
Right.
what your Euripides writes. You're
Ooh.
afraid of a woman like Medea, and so you have convinced yourself that that means he hates women when what it really is that he sees the humanity in women.
Yeah.
He sees them as humans capable of the same things as men, and like
Yeah.
what a threat to the patriarchal
Yeah.
order that is. It's
And
just
and if anyone is listening, if they've never like read a translation of Medea or even better, like seen a modern production of Medea, it rips. It's awesome.
Medea's
It's like
amazing.
but Medea has these incredible speeches that are quite sympathetic. And then she does something truly horrible. And depending on the production, like I've seen productions that are bloody, like bloody.
Yeah. Oh
She comes out just
yeah.
drenched in her children's blood and like
Yeah.
truly a horrific, like unjustifiable act. But
But she justifies it and
but she
you get
justifies it.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, and again, lest someone out there listening thinks that like, are these two advocating the killing of children? No, but the point is that like Euripides was able to like challenge his audience to that point, being like,
Yeah.
let's actually understand the humanity of someone that's going to do something truly
Yeah.
horrific.
Like you understand why she did it because of those speeches. Like you
Yeah.
get why she felt like that was her only choice,
Yeah.
Like he makes you understand why she sees that act as
Yeah.
the only option. But at the same time, simultaneously does not make you believe that it was the right or moral thing to do. He just makes you understand why she felt like that was it. And that's
Well,
why it's so interesting.
but I love that the criticism comes from Aristophanes.
Yeah, well,
And again, I'm thinking about the listener here, just in folks listening, if
Yeah.
they don't know, like now we're just in the world of Athenian playwrights, but Aristophanes was like mostly known for his comedies, and one of his most famous comedies is called The Clouds, where he has a famous take on the philosopher Socrates. And a lot of people that study this stuff go, Aristophanes' Socrates is not really a fair take on Socrates. He makes him to be like a total charlatan, right? Like that he's just like out there, just like spewing nonsense. And it has really nothing in common with like the Socratic philosophy we get from Plato or even from Xenophon, who gives us a slightly more measured version of Socrates. So it makes perfect sense that Aristophanes, a bit of a character assassin when it comes to these folks from ancient Athens, also had a bad take on Euripides,
Oh yeah. No, Aristophanes, I mean, I have a real hate, sometimes love, maybe a little bit relationship with Aristophanes. He is wild. But yeah, it is I mean, yeah, he wrote some unhinged stuff, but it's fascinating to me the way that I mean, I won't say modern scholars, but like up until fairly recently, like there is still this idea that Euripides was a misogynist, that people in the ancient world saw him as that, and the sourcing
Yeah.
is always Aristophanes. And you're like, what are you missing? Like, I don't understand how
Yeah.
people can read something that he wrote satire too. Like, I
Right.
mean, I don't know if he believed it or not. He was also friendly with Euripides, I believe. Like, so it's just so fascinating to me the way that because people have told me, like, I love Euripides and I will shout him from the rooftops, and people have been like, well, you know, the ancient world saw him as misogynist, so clearly he had a problem. And I'm like, no, because Aristophanes made fun of the fact that he wrote terrible women. Like,
Yeah.
if we're gonna become like, we need to figure out how you define misogyny, because writing a woman as a real human being, that's straight equality, my friend. Like,
Yeah,
that's
no,
not
totally.
misogyny.
No, but again, I love that because that's another like those layers of understanding things,
Hmm.
right? Where it's
And just the
just
way that
like,
context matters, and like that our understanding of history is based on hundreds of other people making
yeah,
these assumptions over time.
yeah, yeah. But I love that example because it really is a reminder of how much like us, people that lived thousands of years ago,
Hmm.
truly were. Now, okay, I want to go back to something that came up before. You were talking
Yeah.
about how myth largely exists just in culture, right? It's not necessarily something that is written down in one specific text. It is something that exists orally and in art and in all sorts of sort of cultural production. And I mean, that is the truth, right? I mean, I would say I agree with you, but it's like I just
No.
agree with a
Yeah.
fact.
Facts.
That is just a fact. And that to me, that fact has always been why I've had a problem with the story of Atlantis and a problem with,
You and everyone sane.
right? Right. And so, I mean, I had a lot of fun with the Atlantis, not only the original sort of Atlantis text in Plato, but also all the wild, Atlantis theories that have spun out in the centuries since. I know you've spent some time um, looking at Atlantis. So I want to get your take. Why do you think most folks misunderstand the Atlantis tale?
Ooh, good phrasing of that question, because
Yeah.
I think it opens so many doors. I mean, I think the biggest issue, if we're coming from the place of the very innocent interest and in Atlantis generally, the innocent side, because there's not a very not innocent side. But the individual person who is like, well, of course Atlantis is a mythical place. Of course the story of Atlantis is a myth. That mentality comes from the way, I mean, everything I was saying about myth earlier, and sources, and how we today and over the last centuries and centuries have been taught to understand myth, because we've not been taught the context in the same way. Like, I say we, I mean the general public.
Yeah.
Like, if you're studying it, that's another thing entirely. But the general public who is, like, Greek myth is so in our culture that I don't think there is a person on the planet at a certain age who hasn't at least heard the word, like, Hercules or Heracles or
Yeah.
any of these people. Like, this is a cultural thing. And I think that's where it becomes a problem, which is that we understand it as this cultural touchstone, but we don't understand the cultural context behind it. We think
Mm,
these are the stories, these are the myths of Greece. We think, if the story has these elements, then it is a myth. We lack the deeper understanding of how something becomes a myth. The idea that myth is cultural memory,
mhm.
that myth is this cultural identity more than it is a story more than it is any kind of like narrative structure. It is this cultural thing that exists completely beyond the physical text. And so because we lose that and we just think of it like, well, any fantastical story from ancient Greece is a myth. That's the problem. Because the story of Atlantis is a fantastical story from ancient Greece, but it is not a myth because it lacks all of the things that make a myth, you know? And yeah, like, I mean, I don't know how much or you do or don't want to go into like the details of it because I know we both covered it, but
no, but I mean, and again, for those that maybe have not heard those episodes, right? The story of Atlantis comes from the writings of Plato. It comes from a Greek philosopher writing in the dialogue format, who is trying to make a philosophical point. A Greek philosopher, by the way, who was known to use parable and storytelling to make deeper philosophical points, especially about things like the right and wrong way to organize a society.
Yeah, he had a real thing about cultures and how they were right and wrong. And yeah, and it's well, and all of that and the dialogues he wrote, you know, are these like theorized conversations between people who were dead by the time he was writing it, and in a lot of cases people he never interacted with. And in the story of Atlantis, yeah, it's this dialogue, this philosophical exploration of the quote unquote perfect civilization, and it's told through a conversation with, again, like, I mean, every one of his conversations had Socrates. We don't know quite how much overlap he would have had with Socrates. We know almost nothing about Socrates as a real person outside of Plato's dialogues. And he, you know, he also used all of these other people. There's questions about who, you know, there's people have a lot of the same names, so there's even debate about that. But and then even still in that dialogue, it's like the person who's telling the story of Atlantis is like, I heard it from a guy who heard it from a guy who heard it from some Egyptian priests.
That's right. Yeah.
And so it's like, you know, when you break it down in that kind of way, like there's absolutely no reason to believe it as a myth. There's no reason to believe it as any kind of history or story.
Yeah.
Like, it's so funny to me the way that it's become what it is.
And even if you are the type of person that goes in for the idea that this type of storytelling does contain historical truths sometimes, little kernels of historical truths. And I am one of those people that can get on board with that when there's sort of like, you know, surrounding evidence that can help sort of, you know, beef that up. And it is always exciting when you're like, oh, look, there might be a little kernel of something at the heart of this story. But in the case of Atlantis, it, as you say, it was not a story that seems to have been part of oral storytelling in Greece. There aren't vases that like show the destruction of Atlantis in the same way there are vases that show Theseus killing the Minotaur, right? There aren't other spots where we have people talking about Atlantis until really hundreds of years after.
There's no one pre-Plato.
No, there's no one pre-Plato. And the other thing that I also like to point out about Atlantis every time I can is that they are losers.
Yes, they are the bad ones. Like, why? It's so weird. Yeah, they're like the bad example. Well, and I think what your point about how when you find, you know, those kernels of truth in these philosophical texts, you said that when there's surrounding evidence, to back it up. Yeah, and that's the big thing. There's absolutely zero surrounding evidence. Like, there is not a single story from, like you said, until like a couple hundred years later. And even then, they're usually talking about Plato, talking about Atlantis. They're not talking about Atlantis outside of Plato, because there is no Atlantis outside of Plato. And there's no archaeological evidence. There's no evidence in Egypt. There's no certainty that Solon, who's the guy who heard the story, heard, you know, all that. There's too many layers, but Solon is the name of the person who was supposed to have talked to the priests in Egypt, but definitely, like, you know, was like 2 generations before Plato. Like, there's no evidence that he could speak to these Egyptians or knew Egyptian. Like, and we also have, like, Herodotus went around Egypt and he wrote some wild stuff because there's misunderstandings. Like,
he's my guy.
Yeah, he is a fun and wacky guy. We love a Herodotus version of a hippopotamus. I brought that up yesterday. It's literally on my mind all the time.
Yeah.
But no, there's no surrounding evidence. And so, yeah, it's just this bizarre thing. And then, of course, that's like leaving out even all of the fact that now it's tied to like really horrific white supremacist stuff, which is a whole
Yeah.
other layer.
But
But like,
that's something that doesn't come in until the 19th century,
no,
right?
exactly. There's
You
like
know?
nothing from the point of basically Plato and those like handful of people who referenced Plato referencing it from then until, yeah, like Donnelly comes in and he's like,
Yeah. And then
what
also
if there
like
was a true white race?
yeah,
Like,
right. Yeah, or Helena Blavatsky, right?
oh,
And
yeah,
like
yeah.
and the whole sort of theosophical kind of use of Atlantis, but that's
Hmm.
another
Yeah.
story altogether. Uh
I've done some episodes on that if anyone wants to listen. My Atlantis series is very fun and generally also I have a great logo for it. And I spoke with an archaeologist who's also Canadian, just I'm
mm,
referencing her, Steph Holmhofer, who has done a lot of research into Blavatsky, and oh my gosh, that's
I mean,
wild lady.
I find her fascinating.
Yeah.
I did my own big like three-part series on Helena Blavatsky a
Oh
few
wow,
years
and
ago.
just her, yeah.
Yeah, and because she is this sort of like fountainhead for so much fake history.
Yeah.
And even better, her fake biography that she sort of made up for herself is astounding. And and like and so I'm really fascinated by her, but obviously she's behind a lot of truly problematic
Yeah.
ideas. But it's also weird that there's this figure out there that was like a reference point for both like the Nazis and like new age hippies in the 60s. It's like, whoa,
Hmm.
that is a weird legacy.
Yeah. It's a
If I've ever
broad
heard one.
spectrum of yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Um, but I
I
know
can
we're off down a rabbit hole already. And I've kept you for a while here. Before we go, I do want to talk about your recently announced new
thank
book.
you.
Uh yes, congratulations, by the way.
It's
Um,
very exciting.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, Liv is going to be adapting the Odyssey for younger readers. I know it's still early days for that particular project, but right now, what do you think it is you want to capture about the Odyssey for kids?
I mean, this is like the most exciting thing that's happened to me in a long time. So I lots to say, and I actually delivered the first chunk just before getting on this call with you. So it's
Hey,
top of mind. Um I think I mean the Odyssey generally is my favorite. I just think it's so interesting and exciting but I think the thing that I keep sort of coming back to in all of my research and looking at how this has been done before, both for kids and just generally for the public, is most of the adaptations I've come across really lose what I think ties the story most closely to the epic tradition, the oral tradition, and,
mm,
and epic storytelling broadly. They lose that aspect because and this comes back to what we've been talking about, which this modern idea about the ancient world and what we as modern, I'm gonna say readers, but I mean like anyone taking in this kind of stuff, but we as modern readers want the story to look a certain way that feels comfortable to us
right.
for how we see storytelling now and how we read books now and novels and everything. We want it to look kind of like that. And so what people tend to do with the Odyssey is make it this like chronological story of like
Mm,
Odysseus leaves Troy and then XXX, like all of these different things happen. But of course, the Odyssey as an epic tradition is like the Iliad. It starts right in the middle. That's kind
yeah,
of the
right.
whole thing. They in medias res. It's
Yeah.
you start in the middle, and I think that storytelling technique really serves the Odyssey and really makes you understand like how this stuff was being developed, but also just like how they understood the story. There's a lot of Odysseus lying through his teeth.
Yeah.
There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of big question marks. And so the biggest thing that I'm trying to do is honestly tell the story in the most accurate way possible. And by accurate, I obviously don't mean like factual or anything like that, but like accurate to the original source. I'm My biggest goal is to like not reinvent the wheel. I want to just put the Odyssey into a format and narrative structure that works for kids without changing the narrative structure that is the Odyssey.
Sure.
And generally I'm just excited. Also, I think also we try to sanitize these things for kids. People love to think that the Odyssey is like this big, wild sea adventure story with all of the monsters and the witches and the magic. And it is, except that that's like 3 books out of 24.
Right.
The Odyssey as a thing is not inherently that. And I am like, really hyping that part up because it's for kids and that's fun.
Yeah.
But what I also, am not leaving out the darker parts. I'm not pretending like the narrative ends at a certain place where it doesn't, or things like that. Like, I really just want it to be this thing that's as true to Homer as I can make it.
Sure.
while also
Going
being
to
for
Hades
kids.
and having Achilles tell you that death really sucks.
Yeah. And that Ajax is he's so mad at Odysseus because Odysseus did a terrible thing that led to Ajax's death, and not leaving out the fact that his one of his oldest friends gives him the cold shoulder in the underworld because
Yeah.
Odysseus basically got him killed. And there's so much, and the women in the underworld are my current obsession too. People any kind of adaptation tends to leave out the fact that there is this moment where Odysseus is in the underworld and he's seeing all of these people who come see him of his own accord. And then there's this moment where Persephone, the goddess of the underworld, and the only named god in that section, Hades, does not come up at all. This goddess, sends a really large number of women to go to Odysseus and tell their stories.
Sure.
And that is something that we really rarely have any kind of stories of women, let alone stories about, like, told by the women in some way, and where the men are not the primary focus. And so, but people tend to leave it out. It's not like it's super important to the narrative, but it is super important to the cultural idea. And like, the Odyssey has really great women, and I think they're also left out. And so I'm excited to just tell the Odyssey like it is in the Odyssey, which sounds like real basic, but it also, I've found it's not something that happens often in these kinds of retellings.
Right on. Yeah. Well, the text is rich, right? And as soon as you actually dig into it, there's always going to be aspects of it that sort of previous adapters have sort of left on the table. It's honestly the way that I approach making my podcast. Oftentimes I'll get people that are like, hey, maybe I can do some research for you. I'm like, I appreciate that, but like, the thing I'm trying to do is like look at these sources and like find that nugget that maybe someone else didn't focus on. Not to make this
I'm like, no, but I relate to that so hard. Like, I do have my producer does research for me on a lot of the historical stuff, but anytime there's like a myth that I'm doing or anything, I'm like, don't even bother, because I'm always going to go back to the sources myself, because I physically have to. Like, I have to pick these things out because it's like, so tied to my brain. And like, because you're doing this specific thing,
I used to do a activity with my English students that was all based around the idea that like all human creativity is connected to the fact that you notice things that other people do not, just by virtue of being an individual. And so, just by you being you, when you read the Odyssey, things will pop to you that don't pop to me. And then your job then as the sort of adapter is to underscore those things that pop. And you're like, look at this thing, notice this thing that I noticed that others have not. Or haven't for a while anyway. I can't wait to see what you create. It's gonna be really cool.
Thank you. I'm very excited, and I'm also going to use that whole explanation you just gave as a way to point out why AI is terrible. So thank you.
Oh, sure, yeah.
It's like
let it be known.
Like, the human creativity is why we have everything, every
Agreed.
piece of art and story and history and context, and all of this is because individual human brains look at it and understand things differently, just like you just said. And that's why asking a robot to understand humanity when that robot has been taught by humanity but lacks humanity,
sure,
is pointless, and also uses more water than anything on the planet. And yeah. Anyway,
Fair enough. No, hey, and as someone that is profoundly committed to the ideal of human creativity, I'm completely with you. It's the only thing that's going to save us, Liv.
It truly. But if the AI eats up all the water, then the humans can't keep going.
We're going to win the war against the robots. You and I together.
Single-handedly.
Anyway, thank you so much for coming on, for being so candid, for nerding out with me here. It's been a pleasure. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really fun. It's also so lovely to be on the other side of this, where I'm normally the one asking all the questions and doing the thinking. It's delightful being on the other side. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you just get to riff, you know?
Yeah, I'm good. That's the part I like.
Right on. All right. Well, thanks again. And I'm sure we'll be talking again soon.
Thank you.
Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will explore an all-new historical myth. Thanks again to my guest, Liv Albert, for coming on the show today. Her podcast is called Let's Talk About Myths, Baby, and you can find it everywhere that you get your podcasts. Now, this is normally when I would throw in my Patreon shoutouts, but I'm recording this a little early this time, so I'm going to hold off on my shoutouts until the next episode. So don't worry, I will get to you if you recently pledged $5 or more on Patreon. I hope everyone also enjoyed that bonus episode I did last week. It was a lot of fun. The plan is to do another one very soon. Feel free to comment on anything that you heard in the episode today. If you want to be part of the conversation with me and Liv, send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com, and perhaps I will use that question on the next bonus episode. You can also get in touch with me by going to facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can find me on all the social media. We're talking Instagram at ourfakehistory. We're talking TikTok at ourfakehistory. We're talking Blue Sky at ourfakehistory. And I am also on YouTube. Go to YouTube and check out the Our Fake History digital shorts that I have available there. You can also get Our Fake History merch by going to ourfakehistory.com and following the link to our TeePublic store. As always, the theme music for our show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major. And remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.